These are the texts that are likely to be used in congregations that utilize the common lectionary. And these texts will be used on November the 12th. The first text comes from Joshua, the 24th chapter. And it's part of a series that I think is fairly similar to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, which was at the end of Moses' life. This is at the end of Joshua's life. Just an aside, by the way, the text in Deuteronomy says Moses was 120 when he died. The text in Joshua tells us that he was 110 when he died. So long life for these two leaders. This text in Joshua is a fascinating one to me because Joshua is renewing the covenant of the people at Shechem. And what I find interesting, there's several places where there seems to be a hint at renewal. In Deuteronomy, Moses instructs the people that as soon as they get in the land, they're supposed to go to this area of Shechem. Again, this is probably written well after the fact, when Moses had been alive. And there's something interesting there at Shechem that's not mentioned in our text here, but it is mentioned in other texts. Shechem it's a valley, and on one side of this valley is a mountain, Gerizim, and on the other side of this valley is the mountain Ebal. And what's interesting, you can see one from the other, probably maybe a mile apart, so you can think, here are these mountains, probably very, very large hills, maybe more to our thinking when you and I think of mountains in this country. But from the Shechem area, it'd be very easy to turn your head this way and turn your head that way, and not only see the two, but to notice the difference in the two. Gerizim was lush and fertile. Ebal was virtually barren. And when Moses instructs the people to go to this area, again, this is written after the time and probably is alluding to something right here with what was happening in Joshua's own time. The people are to see the contrast between following the way of the Lord and looking at Gerizim, and following the way of death or of the false gods of the other communities that surround them and the communities that they came from. In fact, Joshua is very specific here in rehearsing the history of the people and reminding them that Abraham himself was called out of a religion that worshiped false gods. It suggests that Abraham's own father worshiped false gods, and that God called Abraham to a new way of life. And then it mentions that the people worshiped false gods in Egypt. It also suggests in this text from Joshua that even now, one of the purposes behind renewing the covenant and being here at Shechem, between these two mountains, even though they're not mentioned, is to remind the people that it's time once again to challenge them to throw away their idols to false gods. So this notion of worshiping false gods continually has come up and will continue to come up in the period of the Old Testament. It certainly is a good hint to us that history tends to repeat itself, and it may also challenge us to be thinking about what false gods may loom in our own culture, the things that we worship that blur our sense of what is good and what is bad, that blur us from having the fertile and abundant life that was represented by Gerizim versus the deadly life that was represented by Mount Ebal. So that's the purpose of that text. The other thing about the text in Joshua is it does read as though there's a rhythm that this text is recording, as though this is a ritual renewal that has occurred every so often. I mean, I can't say it any more precisely because while it looks that way, it doesn't say this is what they did every year or every 10 years. But to think that all of the people could gather at once here and be summoned from all of the lands which the different tribes had been allotted is a little far-fetched. Probably what was happening here is that leadership or representatives from each of the 12 tribes were here and then would relay back that we renewed the covenant and we were reminded again to throw away false gods and idols and so forth. It's a potent text, particularly given the geographic location between those two mountains, to serve as a constant reminder between the way of life, Gerizim, and the way of death, Ebal. The Psalm of the day is Psalm 78, the first 7 verses. This is one of the few historic psalms in the Old Testament. By historic psalms, I mean one that rehearses the history of the people. So it may be worth a read just to look through to see how that rehearsal takes place. It's always good to see what's emphasized and good to see what is not so emphasized in any of these, because they're all written with a purpose in the same way that books of history are written with certain purposes in mind to highlight certain things as part of our own education. The New Testament text, the New Testament epistle from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, probably is worth thinking about the background of the church in Thessalonica for just a couple of minutes to get into this text. The church in Thessalonica has a lot of new converts. A fresh reminder here, one of Paul's evangelistic strategies was to go to these particular areas around the Aegean Sea and first identify where there was a Jewish synagogue or where Jews tended to convene. And so a lot of these early, not all, but a lot of these early congregations that Paul had a hand in establishing began with a large number of Jewish converts to Christianity. Here in Thessalonica, that's the case, but now we are getting a number of converts out of the Greco-Roman world, whose worldviews, whose senses of eternity are entirely different. So, for example, for the Greeks, the soul was immortal in the sense that the soul existed independent of a body, that the soul periodically would inhabit a body, and that person would be alive, and then when that person died, the soul would go off somewhere and maybe once again at some later time inhabit another body. That's not the culture of Christianity. The culture of Christianity is we have one life that we have been given as a gift from God. And so when these new converts come in from an entirely different background, they've got different questions that they're asking, trying to embrace the person of Christ and belief in Christ as Messiah. They're still going to have their own sets of questions. And what we have today is Paul answering a question of those new converts. Another thing to keep in mind that comes from early Christianity is this sense that Jesus was going to return soon, probably before a lot of people had died. And so these new converts were wondering, well, what's happening to those people who have died before Jesus returns? And this is Paul's way of answering those people as specifically as he can answer the question. And what Paul is reminding them is that God is both the Lord of the dead and the living, that in God's mind, we are who we are, whether we are alive or dead. It is still us. There's no separation of some part that drifts off into immortality without us. It's still us, whether we're dead or alive. And so with the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ, both those who are still alive and those who have already died in the Lord will be called together to join with Christ. And I think what he does is I think he has a secondary element in there too. The people who have died in the Lord before the second coming, that does not mean that in any way they were less appreciated or more subject to punishment than anybody else. It's just what happened, because the Lord is the Lord of the dead and the living. And so those that go first with the call of the second coming of Christ are those honored. And again, that's kind of I think more of a Hebrew hyperbole to show that those who are dead are not second class. They rise to the top of the class. They're the ones summoned first, and then the ones that are still alive are also summoned. It's a Hebrew way of letting us know that no one is greater than the other, that both are being honored. Probably at this time, it seems as though, if you read the text carefully, that Paul is assuming here that he's also part of those that are still going to be alive when Jesus comes. We look at a later book, say, oh boy, I can't remember now whether it's 1 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, or 2 Corinthians, the 4th chapter, where Paul seems to be thinking now that it's quite likely that he's not going to be around when the second coming occurs, that he will already have died in Christ. The point of the Thessalonians passage, or the point of the one in I think it's 2 Corinthians, is that it really doesn't matter. That what really matters is that those of us in the Lord are both held precious in the sight of God, no matter whether we are alive at that coming or whether we have already died. We're still being claimed by the power of Christ. The second item that's in Thessalonians, it may be a more important part, is that when Paul speaks of Jesus and the death of Jesus, he is reminding those hearers that the Christ in whom we believe put his hope in God. And God demonstrated that the hope in the eternal Father was worth our clinging to by raising Jesus from the dead, the first from the dead. So that's Paul's way of reminding the people that even our Messiah was clinging to that same hope that he invites us to cling to. The last text is from Matthew, the 25th chapter, and there are going to be 3 parables in here near the end of Matthew. This is the first one. It's the parable of the 10 bridesmaids. I have looked up on several occasions early Jewish practices, or Jewish practices 2,000 years ago with regard to weddings. And I know they're big feasts, and some of these things take a longer time. I don't want to try to explain too much into this. Why the groom is late, we don't know. We can speculate, but that's all we'd be doing, is speculating that maybe he was still negotiating the bride price. Who knows? Maybe he got held up in traffic. I mean, who knows why, but the groom is late. And the point is not that the groom is late. The point here is that 5 of the bridesmaids were prepared for whatever might happen. They're the ones that brought the extra oil. And 5 were not prepared for anything but their own sense of expectation, which was, well, the wedding's supposed to start at 2 o'clock or whatever time. We're here, he's not here, and they already have, as part of the ceremony, their lamps are already burning oil. And before the groom comes, they're running out. So they have to go get more because they weren't prepared. And I think that is the message here in this parable, is preparation, because we never know what's going to happen. And I don't know that this is to be looked at in an apocalyptic way, like this is an end of times thing, surprise, here it comes. But it is an encouragement to us to be prepared to live and be prepared to die, come what may, with our faith always a deep portion of who we are, never left behind, never on the side, and we're always equipped to live into the moment, whatever the moment may bring. Well, these are the texts for the week, probably again for Sunday, November the 12th, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week.